I mean, everyone's got a plan for, quote, how we're going to beat China. My personal opinion, we're not going to beat China, and China's not going to beat us. We are both going to be major powers in the world for decades to come, if not longer. So how do we make that work? How do we figure out how to compete with each other? How do we figure out how to nudge China in the directions that we want to nudge them?
This is Roger Zakheim, director of the Reagan Institute. Welcome to our podcast, Reaganism. We have an exciting guest this week, Congressman Adam Smith, the senior Democrat, the ranking member on the House Armed Services Committee. We are not going to be discussing the National Defense Authorization Act. We are going to be talking to Congressman Smith today about his recent trip to the People's Republic of China. Came back not too long ago. Congressman, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Roger. I appreciate the chance. It's always good to see you.
Great to see you. I have fond memories of sitting next to you for many more hours than you wanted during Armed Service Committee markups. Fortunately for you today, This is virtual and just for 30 minutes. But I am eager to spend that time to hear a little bit about this trip you took to the PRC. Perhaps let me just contextualize. We haven't had one of these in 5+ years. I don't know when the last time you were there. And sort of what drove you to take this trip, and how difficult was it to get there?
Sure. I mean, the last House delegation trip was in 2019. Senator Schumer went in 23 with a couple Senate Republicans as well. But there's been a general attitude in several administrations now and in the leadership in the House that we don't like China. We don't want to talk to them. We shouldn't go there. Which I always thought was just the wrong approach. I mean, I get the approach that you don't want to legitimize a regime, like you wouldn't want to go to North Korea. But China is a major power in the world, one of our largest trading partners. They are a fact. They are legitimate, whether we show up there or not. And because we haven't been there, I think the ability to have a dialogue and open lines of communication has really faltered. And I don't think the two countries understand each other at all. And we have issues that we should be talking about, both, things that we disagree on, potential conflicts around, Taiwan, the Spratly Islands, South China Sea issues, what's going on in Ukraine, China's relationship with Russia, Iran, North Korea, and also, China's significant military buildup, particularly around nuclear weapons. So there is definitely the potential for conflict. And I don't think ignorance is a good way to walk into that. And I'm also of the opinion, and I know this is somewhat controversial, that we need to figure out how to coexist with China. I mean, everyone's got a plan for, quote, how we're going to beat China. My personal opinion, we're not going to beat China, and China's not going to beat us. We are both going to be major powers in the world for decades to come, if not longer. So how do we make that work? How do we figure out how to compete with each other? How do we figure out how to nudge China in the directions that we want to nudge them? A whole bunch of different issues there. But those issues are not going to be solved by not talking to each other.
Well,
senior levels of leadership need to get engaged in a conversation, in my opinion.
Lots to unpack there. I guess starting at the outset in terms of just having conversation and being in dialogue. Secretary Hegseth recently, I believe, spoke with the defense minister. It was the first time that happened, I believe, during the Trump administration. Of course, we'll get to your conversation with their defense minister, Dong Zhong. But before we go there, you sort of outline both the value, the agenda items, but also your view with respect to PRC that, hey, we need to coexist. Now, I think contextualizing this, if you look at the analogous time would be Cold War. That's an appropriate one. I think whether or not you think you're in a second Cold War or not, I don't really want to debate that here, but simply that's a relevant analogous period of time, and we were in conversation throughout or much of that period of the Cold War. So I think most people sort of wrap their heads around it. And even if you want to adopt the outlook that you shared here, that we're going to have to coexist, that winning is not the right nomenclature. How you coexist and what coexistence looks like is quite critical, because just think about the menu of issues you just shared, right? When you talk about nuclear modernization, Spratly Islands, Taiwan, right? The economic issues. This is a highly dynamic situation where each side is competing. I would assume that nomenclature would still be acceptable to
Absolutely.
you. And so we would want to compete in a fashion where you don't say winning, but certainly where we're advantaging U.S. interests and certainly not working against U.S. interests, right?
Yeah, no, you want to try to protect our critical interests. Certainly, I think one major difference, and I take your point on the Cold War that we talked even during that, but this situation is different. I mean, China is a major economic power. I mean, we were not in a economic trading relationship with the Soviet Union, not in any meaningful way, and we are with China. So yeah, I mean, competition is one way of doing it, but I think both sides are sort of trapped in a way of looking at the other. I think China's perception is that the U.S. wants to contain and weaken China on the global stage and even regionally in Asia. And then the perception going the other way from us is that China wants to replace us as the global power. And we sort of walk down those lanes and get to an intractable place
Yeah.
where we can't deal with these people because they're trying to weaken us. When the truth of the matter is, there's competition. I mean, obviously, each side wants to be as strong as
Right.
possible. But that doesn't mean that it's a zero-sum game or we're both bent on the destruction of the other. And I think that perception has grown up on both sides. There's a lot of Americans who think China's bent on the destruction of the US. There's a lot of Chinese who think that America is bent on the destruction of China. So we shouldn't be. So we should dispel that notion and begin to have a conversation from a more productive
Yeah,
place.
I mean, I think certainly the U.S. took an outlook prior to President Trump's first term in office. Maybe you can argue before that as well, where it was this idea of, hey, both sides can compete and can do well out of it, right? This
Yeah.
idea that from the U.S. standpoint, the economic integration might allow for some sort of a change in the politics of China and their political system, democratization in some form or another. But that seems to be a thing of the past. I think rightly so, and we've taken the security challenge posed by China quite seriously. You do in your work on the Armed Services Committee. I think if you look at the Congress over the past decade plus, perhaps longer, the work you've done stands out in terms of how it's strengthening the U.S. military with an eye towards the military challenge posed by China, and whether it's the perceptions are reality on both sides. Whether we want to contain China because we view anything beyond containing any relaxation of containing it would undermine our interests, or we're that we see that China wants to become this global power and replace the United States. I mean, there's certainly evidence of that too. What I hear you saying is let's not make that self-fulfilling in some respects.
Right. Well, and look, China wants more influence in the world.
Yeah.
And that's well, duh. I mean, China has become a rising power, and most of the structures in terms of how power is distributed in the world were set up post World War II, and rightfully so. And I'm a strong supporter of what the U.S. did after World War II and the world order that we
Yeah.
built. I know it's popular now to sort of crap all over it by seeing a fault here or a fault there, but relatively speaking, human civilization has never been easy. So it's never going to be a perfect situation. But the world that we helped build after World War II, through the Marshall Plan, through efforts to rebuild Japan, through things like the United Nations, the IMF, all the different alliances that we built and partnerships, I think we built a pretty decent world. In fact, the world we helped build was the world that China was able to rise in. So that's fine, but now China isn't what they were when that world was being built. They're a much bigger player in the
Yeah.
world, and they want a larger say in it. And I don't actually think that is that unreasonable. What we got to talk about is where it does become somewhat
Right. And
unreasonable.
certainly, from a security standpoint, there's a lot to point to where China, in asserting itself, its own perception as a major power, has been looking to undermine the status quo that favors the United States that we've built, as you point out. And obviously, outside this conversation, the different approaches and how to deal with that, and how one perceives China, whether their political system is one that we should accept and coexist with or not. There's a select committee in the House of Representatives that thinks deeply about that works on this.
Yeah.
But I guess now's a good opportunity with that context and sort of laying the groundwork. Love to hear your reflections on this trip. What you thought you might see in Beijing when you were there, and to what extent that's what you saw, or what was different, and sort of your takeaways after being on the ground and engaging with counterparts broadly, both on the economic side as well as on the security.
Yeah. Well, a couple things really struck me. One, China is by and large a fairly well-run country, and on in terms of capitalism and economics, there is a lot of competition and ideas being generated. We visited several businesses while we were there. A maker of smartphones, which is a Chinese company, but then we also visited Microsoft and Medtronics, U.S. companies that are located there. And within China, I mean, there is a fair amount of freedom when it comes to capitalism. Now, when it comes to political expression, that's an entirely different conversation. But Beijing and Shanghai, where we're at, very well run, thriving, clean, vibrant cities, and a real economic climate of growth. And so that one big impression. Second impression is, unlike a couple years ago, I mean, probably from like 2014 to 2023, China was unbelievably belligerent towards the US. I went to the Shangri-La dialogues once and listened to the Chinese defense minister basically rail against the United States of America for the entire 30 minutes of his speech. It was sort of like Khrushchev banging his shoe on the table, "We will bury you" sort of thing. I think ever since the Xi Biden summit in San Francisco in 23, there's been an effort to tone that rhetoric down and an openness to saying, hey, maybe we can have a more civil conversation between us. So those are two big things. But third, there's still some big differences. And I think one of the biggest problems that I saw in China is they are still obsessed with what they refer to as the century of
Mm.
humiliation. They feel insecure, victimized, and they have to show their strength to prove that, we're never going to let this happen again. And one of the messages I deliver to them is, you're kind of past that now.
Yeah.
All
Look
right.
at your
Maybe
size and
you were
economic
that,
strength. Like this is,
yeah, maybe you were that 75-pound weakling in high school who everybody picked on, but you got to shuck that attitude because you're now a big, powerful country with a powerful economy and a powerful military. And if you keep acting like the victim that has to rise up and punch everybody in the face when you're now this big, powerful country, that's a problem. I mean, as I asked me, what are you fighting over a bunch of rocks in the Philippines for? I mean, this is territory that's been internationally recognized as part of the Philippines. And they have an argument about how, back, I forget when the era was, post World War II, when we were talking about, how to sort of, Japan was, down, how to reallocate the lands that Japan had conquered, everything's going on. And I said, so what?
right.
Okay, so what? I mean, let's say for the sake of argument that you're right. And in 1948, it was promised to you that these chunks of things would belong to you, and now everything happened and it's not. Big freaking deal. Okay, you got a global economy to run, and you're going to get into a conflict with a neighbor over, and what drives them is this sense of
Sure.
pride. I have a Pulp Fiction quote, which I can't do on this podcast here at this point. Or analogy might be. There's a quote that's wrapped around an analogy. But they're too obsessed with that. And I think it's leading to conflicts with a lot of their neighbors. And part of, and I expressed it, that's why we're concerned.
Yeah. I mean,
All
some would
right.
say it's not simply their sort of this mentality of victimhood, but actually their expansionist and ambition that extends beyond their economy, that they want the political control that they feel is their due, and they feel they're big enough and strong enough to get it. I mean, that gets to Taiwan.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I do think this century of humiliation thing really animates the Chinese people as well as the
100%.
Chinese leadership. Now, is the leadership just using that as an excuse to achieve those other objectives? Maybe. But I think a lot of it also is, born of that a feeling of having been victimized and we're never going to be a victim again. So we're going to go reach out and grab everything we can. And I think now that they're a global power, they need to take a more responsible approach to that.
Well, I think that's great feedback, and we'll see if they internalize. Let's go to your second big takeaway, which is sort of you notice a shift in the belligerency to the United States. If I heard you correctly, you referenced
Yeah.
your experience at Shangri-La dialogue, where you had the formal communist talking points and haranguing against the U.S. Sort of making you think of Khrushchev during the Cold War. Tell us about what kind of which conversation or conversations gave you that takeaway. In particular, maybe it's a good entry point to your meeting with the Chinese Minister of Defense.
Yeah. Well, actually, it started. I had two dinners with the Chinese ambassador to the U.S., in which we had a very robust, couple-hour long
This is
argument
David Perdue.
conversation.
David Perdue is our ambassador, correct?
No, no, no,
Oh,
no, no, no.
oh,
The
to the
Chinese
U.S. Sorry,
ambassador.
not the U.S.
Oh,
ambassador.
by the way, David Perdue is doing an amazing job as the U.S. ambassador to China, and he has an understanding of it. Wrong podcast to make this point, but it's like Trump every once in a while makes a smart choice, and I'm like, damn, where the hell did that come from? Because David Perdue actually he lived in Hong Kong for a while.
Yeah,
He's an experienced business
right.
person. He's got real good connection. He understands it. He's doing a fabulous job for us over there, as are all of our State Department employees. This was the Chinese ambassador to the U.S., who forgive me, I forget his name. But we had two very long dinners and we discussed this. And the general gist was, hey, shouldn't we talk? And he said, well, let's get you into China and let's do that.
Mm.
And so he was very helpful in setting up these meetings. And in all of the meetings that we had, foreign minister, defense minister, leaders of the People's Congress, and also we met with the premier, who's basically number two leadership position in China.
Mm-hmm.
There was a willingness there. I mean, I've talked to people before who've been in meetings with Chinese interlocutors, and they're like, for an hour, they lecture you.
Yeah.
This was much more of a back and forth. And don't get me wrong, they still had their strong aspects, but there was a willingness to engage in a dialogue with the central premise that we need to talk more. That Danzhong, I can't remember the name. I'm terrible with names.
The premier.
I'm terrible with
Yeah.
English names for that matter. But the premier, same thing. I mean, there was a desire to, hey, maybe we can start talking to each other and get to a better
Why?
place, and that was true
What,
of
what's
all
your
of my
what's
meetings.
your assessment as to why you've had this sort of change in attitude? Is it a function of sort of the high stakes tariff showdown we're in? Is it maybe they're realizing their own strength, economic, political, and otherwise, and that there has to be a different way that, or what else do you think's kind of leading to
Yeah,
that?
I think it started before
Yeah,
that. Well, frankly, I think it was more a matter of weakness. I mean, China is experiencing some significant economic headwinds
yeah,
right now. They made major investments in real estate, and they are over leveraged to a degree that matches our, Great Recession of 2008. And they're trying to navigate their way around that. They have a very high unemployment problem with young people. They've focused so much on exports,
mm,
they have not really driven up consumer demand within their own country, and that's starting to create economic challenges for them. Obviously, they have the demographic challenge that, born of the one child policy. They have an aging population. And I think to some degree, China does want to be a responsible player on the global stage. Now, that competes with their concern about us. And, it's a chicken and egg situation. Do they want us, to be weaker because they want to take over the world and rule it the way they want to rule it? Or are they concerned that we are a challenge to their more legitimate needs, whether it's economic or how they view the Taiwan situation? So that still balances, but there is more of a desire to say, well, I think they recognize that they can't just go it alone in the world, number one. And number two, all this in stage capitalism, Marxist Leninist nonsense, which is still kind of part of the Chinese, Communist Party's way of looking at the world. I think they're starting to realize that we're not going anywhere.
Well, definitely good to hear on the latter. Everything I read and heard from experts on Xi is that he's a devout Marxist here, and this is this is something
Yeah.
that's not going away. In fact, it's sort of ratcheted up from the purges of the party. I'm interested to get your assessment of actually the PLA after talking to the Chinese Minister of Defense. That ideologically speaking, could be, as you note, that you feel a climate of growth in Beijing and Shanghai, but at the same time, we have seen more political repression bleeding into the PRC's economy than we saw prior to Xi taking control. And so, yeah, I think the deal is most people understand is that if you live in the PRC, you give up your political freedom. You can be a capitalist, but you got to do it in such a fashion that the party comes first, and you're willing to give up those freedoms. Yeah, you could be secure. But I think that my sense is, that equation is only going to lean more towards, you know, the oppression of those freedoms, or certainly suppression of those freedoms, than not over the past, I don't know,
Yeah.
decade or so.
Well, the other aspect of this, 2 points. One, COVID.
Mm,
And when China stepped in and tried to control their population, particularly in 2022 when they shut down
yeah.
Shanghai, they realized the limits of their ability to control the population. There was a severe backlash against that. And they're trying to figure out how to navigate their way, through that particular challenge. That was another thing that made them think that they needed to change course a little bit. The second thing that's worth noting is, based on the flow chart of how the Chinese Communist Party governs, the defense minister is not necessarily the most powerful military figure in China.
Hmm.
There is a member of their Politburo who, is a party person first and foremost, who we did not get the opportunity to meet with, who has a fair amount of say in that as well. So you've got the tension within China, because I forget what percentage, a relatively small percentage of the Chinese people are members of the Chinese Communist Party. And they call all of the
Right.
shots at the end of the day. So how they feel about the military buildup and what role they see their military playing could potentially conflict to some degree with what the defense minister
Well,
views.
it's a great point. Just COVID in terms of that being sort of a humbling moment for the PRC and the party, the sort of limiting their reach. The way we read about it in the United States is sort of the police state has been perfected by the Chinese Communist
Right.
Party, and they have their population sort of following along and behaving well, and they don't want to get sort of negative credits, and they lose whatever economic opportunity if they're misbehaving. And COVID seems to be sort of the exception there. With the remaining time we have, uh, you're there, very experienced member of Congress, senior Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, which means you have a very sophisticated understanding of the People's Liberation Army. And we talk about how we should view the PRC. Is this something where we want to contain them? We have to coexist. We could debate that another time. One thing I think is quite clear is we're seeing the most dramatic military buildup, modernization generations. You probably have to go back to Reagan's buildup in the United States, or actually more significantly, the Soviet buildup during the Cold War. I take your point that the economic power of the PRC is far substantial and meaningful in a way that was not relevant to the Cold War equation. But there is an analogy, I would think, in terms of the very significant military growth and modernization that we're seeing from the PRC.
Yes.
What did you learn about that, and kind of as you left your meetings in Beijing with the defense minister and others? Um, do you think about it differently, or do you have a deeper sense of what they're of what?
I have a deeper sense, but I think it's still very much to be determined.
What do you mean by that?
I think there is a perfectly logical approach when, China has seen the rhetoric going back and forth between China and the U.S., and when they've seen the U.S. military. When we knocked out the regime in Afghanistan, when we knocked out Hussein in Iraq, the way we've, prosecuted the global war on terror, they respect our military and they know the strength that we have. And to the extent that they think that the U.S. is trying to contain them, I think they could legitimately say, look, we got to have a strong enough military so that we can't be pushed around by these guys. That's legitimate. But, And I think the buildup is still worrisome because you can very quickly go from a defensive posture to an offensive posture. And certainly, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking, they've got designs on the sovereign territory of more than a half dozen of their neighbors. Are they building that military up to make sure that we can't cause them problems, or are they building that military up to make sure that they can grab what territory they want to grab when they want to grab it? And that, as I said, I think that could go either way. And I think we need to be, very, very diligent in making sure we have an adequate deterrence to deal with that challenge.
Yeah, well said. And I think part of this is, how we look at the status quo, right? You can look at the United States as a status quo power. I wouldn't actually subscribe to that, but if you just adopted that outlook, we just want the current, sort of strategic ambiguity with respect to Taiwan to
Yeah,
remain, right? As you said at the outset, like we're not trying to change the status quo of the Philippines, so the PRC, please don't. And no matter what we're doing militarily, and this is why I think some dialogues is essential. We don't have
yeah.
designs.
But you better understand each other. One thing I picked up on this. Well, I mean, China is very much of the opinion that the current government in Taiwan is hell bent on independence. I don't think that's
Yeah,
true.
nor
I
do
mean,
I. Yeah.
certainly the current, President Lee has said some things in the past, and there's things in their platform. But if you poll the Taiwanese people, fully 70% of them are opposed to independence. They're not taking any steps towards independence. So I think China legitimately fears that. I also think they use it as an excuse to justify their military buildup. But that was one big point that I drove home. U.S. policy towards Taiwan and China has not changed. We are one China. We embrace the one China principle, one China, two systems, number one, but number two, that those systems will not be brought together by force.
Peacefully resolved.
Um, exactly. And, any notion that the U.S. has changed its position and is trying to agitate for Taiwanese independence is absolutely untrue.
So
Again, that's something that a regular dialogue could get a better understanding between the two sides on.
absolutely. Let's close out with two areas where it would seem that the PRC is, has these ambitions to actually disrupt the status quo, and is going to use their military and their economy to realize that. Um, we'll start with Taiwan. Did you give them the feedback? Hey, part of the reason why maybe this government's in power in Taiwan is because of the encirclement and the aggression.
Yeah,
How did you put any points to the board on that, or are they unwilling to hear it? Because
I
what's
tried.
changed
I don't
is the
know.
level of their military aggression.
Yeah, I don't know if I did or not. And I emphasize like them freaking out every time a member of Congress sets foot in Taiwan. Look, we're the United States Congress. We want to go talk to people in Taiwan. We're going to go talk to people in Taiwan. And all of their and I did make that point that all of their military exercises. I mean, that just presents the threat of a by force retaking of Taiwan, so that we're perfectly justified and Taiwan is perfectly justified in trying to arm itself to deter that. So yeah, that's a matter of escalation, and I don't know whether or not I scored any
Well,
points, but I
I
made the
think it's
point.
essential because I think I'm glad you did. I'm not surprised knowing you and knowing having a sense of your outlook. But what you wouldn't want is the leadership, whether it's Li Huang, the premier or the minister of defense, to think that hey, Congress wants a dialogue, right? And dialogue is sort of an alternative to the deterrence that we're seeking to realize with respect to Taiwan. I mean, they need, it's an essential message that if you're going to ratchet up the aggression, then the U.S. military, consistent with our
With our
policy and
50-year
Development
policy,
Relations
almost
Act,
50-year
and that
policy
we're
now.
gonna deter it, and that I think is as critical as, of course, picking up and understanding, having relationships with some of these counterparts. Last question before we close out. This is a shortened podcast. Grateful for your time. Uh, you know, Something you said earlier with respect to the economy. Yes, it has sort of these capitalist elements, but it seems to be understood, and I don't think it's quite challenged that the party rules, and the party will come in and reach within their capitalist system, or however you want to describe it, and take what they want, and everything can and will be used for what the party wants, which increasingly seems to be tied to the security and defense portfolios. That comes to a head as it relates to Ukraine, where we're seeing that there is not simply just creating space for Russia to operate, but also actually, feeding in its commercial technology.
And I made that point again, that look, if China's going to be a responsible power, if you talk all this time about respect for sovereignty, you're making Russia's war in Ukraine possible. They bristled at that comment. But I said, look, if you had the same sanctions on Russia that we have on Russia, the war would be over. Period. It'd be over. Russia could not continue it. Well, we're doing business and, they're legitimate question. You can't ask us. But so, yeah, all true. But if you're going to be a responsible actor on the global stage concerned about sovereignty, you've got to be consistent in that policy. And I did raise the issue of profound concerns about China's relationship with Russia, given the aggressive nature that Putin is taking to so many of his neighbors.
Last question, and we'll let you go. You leave Beijing, you're having these conversations. One of the big security discussions as we think about our national security strategy, national defense strategy, is really understanding what the relationship is between the PRC, Putin's Russia. You can throw in Iran, you can throw in North Korea, and this is the axis. I guess is the easiest way to talk about it. Everybody seems to adopt their favorite name to refer to this. Do you leave there thinking, hey, we're getting about right in terms of who the allies they're picking and the people they're partnering with, or
No, I leave there thinking that we've got a long way to go. And this gets into the broader question, and this is a big national security focus that I'll leave you with, and we can use this as a teaser for a future conversation. So the reality of what we face in the U.S. is a growing number of countries in the world want to weaken us for a variety of different reasons. And certainly the organizers of that are Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. But you see through the BRICS countries, the countries that have joined there. And look, to some degree, I get it. The U.S. has been the big, powerful country in the world, and people chafe under that. And look, Trump slapping tariffs on everybody in the world has made people realize we don't want to be too terribly reliant on the U.S. either. And so you've got this effort. And so how do we confront that? Do we take on all comers here and just try to fight back? Personally, I think we'd be better off meeting our national security needs if we could come to some sort of accommodation with China. Because I know China's the biggest, most powerful country, so they're the pacing threat and all of that. But in terms of how I evaluate people, North Korea, Kim Jong-un, forgive me, batshit crazy. That's going to be a problem with nuclear weapons. Iran is a bunch of suicidal maniacs and religious fanatics who are disrupting all manner of countries throughout the Middle East. Putin is kind of a homicidal maniac. Those are going to be three countries that are going to be tough to work with for a variety of different reasons. China, they want to do business. They want to grow. They want to feed their people. And I don't really buy into the idea that China is focused on world domination. They certainly have pride. The Han people in particular have a lot of pride in who they are and the role that they see themselves playing in the world. If we can figure out how to work with China and convince them that it ain't good for them if Russia starts starting wars throughout Eastern Europe, it ain't good for them if Iran continues to light fire to the Middle East, I think there's the possibility of getting into a better relationship with China. This isn't going to happen tomorrow or next year, but it's what I think we should try to work towards.
We'll give you the last word, but I think that's a debate, and one would be fun to have if you come back and do the podcast, because it really goes down to how you view the People's Republic of China and what their intent is. And I know you know the arguments on both sides.
Yeah. Well, and the devil's in the details there.
Absolutely.
I mean that's just a broad outline. Believe me, how you sketch in that outline is 99.9% of the issue.
Well, I know you agree with this. However we engage, we should engage from a position of strength, certainly militarily and economically, and so that's sort of like the baseline, and we need to do better on both those fronts. We'll leave it there. Congressman Adam Smith, the senior Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, back from a congressional delegation to China. Thank you for your time, and I think we're going to have you back, despite what your staff says. We're going to bother you for more time.
Anytime. Thanks, Roger. Great to see you.